Good morning to you all who are gathered here at Shir Tikva in Minneapolis and all who are gathering online. We're going to open today with Sam and Emma Richman, two of Sumner Richman's grandchildren, accompanied by Mary Jo Othman, who will offer music to open this space and open our hearts this morning. So welcome to you. Welcome to all of us here gathered at Shir Tikva. Welcome to all of us gathering online, and welcome to all of us whose hearts are now open. Thank you so much to you, to Sam, and to Emma. And welcome as we gather to remember Sumner Richman. My name is Rabbi Ariel Lekach-Rosenberg, and on behalf of the entire Shir Tikva community, I extend love and wishes of comfort to all those who are grieving the death of Sumner. Welcome to family gathered from near and far, in person and online, and welcome to dear friends, to colleagues, to neighbors. So we gather today to remember Sumner. Sumner was a committed partner to Joyce, a loving and active father and grandfather, a passionate scientist and an educator, a mentor and a loving friend, and a beloved past president of Shir Tikva. We honor and we welcome Nancy and Robert and Andrea and Freya and Karen. We welcome Sam and Emma, and we welcome Noah online. We welcome nieces and nephews. We welcome family who is grieving. And if you're on YouTube today, I want to invite you throughout the course of this service to share words of comfort and of memories that you have of Sumner in the chat. That chat is recorded, and the family will be returning to read those memories and those wishes of comfort. And so although we can't see your faces here today, your presence is felt, and we are so grateful for the words that you'll share in the chat throughout the service. So I was lucky to get to know Sumner when I arrived at Shir Tikva in 2017. I sat with Sumner and Joyce in their apartment as Sumner unfurled a tapestry of stories about his life with Joyce. He told me about his childhood perch above the ocean in Nantasket Beach, and about the story for the ages of wooing Joyce in a canoe. And what stood out to me that first time I sat with Sumner and Joyce was his fierce intellect and his talent as a mentor. There I was, a newly minted rabbi, sitting with this big macher former president, and he, over the course of our conversation, broadcast tremendous support and encouragement. I can imagine he must have encouraged students and new colleagues like this many times over at Lawrence University with his shining eyes, his insightful questions, and a healthy dose of heckling. I was made better as a rabbi of Shir Tikva because I got to know Sumner Richman. And I know that every rabbi who has served this community and knew him was guided and grounded by Sumner's stories and his advice and his care. So we will have the chance to hear eulogies and poetries from Sumner's three children, Nancy and Robert and Freya. But before then, it's the Jewish tradition to offer words of psalms to help us come into this space, to help us catch our breath and slow our hearts down. We get to allow ourselves to open to the sacred work of remembering and honoring Sumner's life. So I'll offer words from Psalm 121. Esa einai el leharim me'ain yavo ezri. Esa einai el leharim me'ain yavo ezri. Ezri me'im Adonai ose shamayim va'aretz. Ezri me'im Adonai ose shamayim va'aretz. Esa einai el leharim me'ain yavo ezri. Esa einai el leharim me'ain yavo ezri. These words from Psalm 121, fitting for someone so captured by the natural world, a student of the natural world. I turn my eyes to the mountains, and one can extrapolate to the seas. Where does my help come from? Where is my comfort? My help comes from creation. My help comes from the Creator, the maker of heaven and earth. So it's my honor now to invite up Robert Richman, who will be followed by Freya Richman and then by Nancy Richman.
All of Dad's friends called him Sub, which means that everyone called him Sub because everyone was Dad's friend. He always said he got that nickname because as a child he could swim underwater longer than any of his friends. That may have been apocryphal. He also told me that the Sumner Tunnel, which connects Logan Airport to downtown Boston, was named after him because he rode his bike through it every morning when he delivered the morning papers. If you've ever been in the Sumner Tunnel, you will know that that can't possibly be true. But however he came to be called Sub, the name aptly foreshadowed his interests and career. Dad had three great passions which defined his life: the ocean, education, and his family. Dad's love of the ocean started early. He grew up on the south shore of Massachusetts Bay in Nantasket, just south of Boston. He lived at 57 Edgewater Road, which was really a misnomer. His house was not on the edge of the water. It was actually built on the seawall, and at high tide, the water came right against the house, which meant that he could jump into the water from his back porch at high tide. But low tide was even better, because then his backyard was a tidal flat where he and his best friend, Bobby Fraser, could go clamming and find sea worms and jellyfish and horseshoe crabs and other exotic marine creatures. Is it any wonder that he became a marine biologist? When Sub and Bobby weren't in the water, they were on it. Dad had a series of boats that he and Bobby explored the bay with: kayaks, rowboats, sailboats, and small motorboats. The housekeeper, Minnie, who was like a mother to Sub, would hang a white sheet from the back porch when it was time for him to come home for dinner, which was a good theory, but often Dad was far offshore, out of sight of the sheet. And from his many stories, it seemed that no sooner would he lose sight of land than calamity would strike. The motor wouldn't start, the rudder would break, the sail would tear, and he and Bobby would find themselves adrift in the middle of the ocean. And when Dad wouldn't show up for dinner, Minnie would call the Coast Guard, who would go to Dad's favorite spots to rescue him. Dad and the Coast Guard were on a first-name basis. The ocean was not the only love that Dad discovered on Edgewater Road. Fortunately for us, every summer the Clemens family rented a cottage at 49 Edgewater Road, a few doors down from Dad. And Joyce Clemens, as it turned out, was a junior in high school, and Dad had just graduated from high school. They started dating, and soon Dad was serenading Joyce from his kayak. His boats became the Joyce 1 and the Joyce 2. They were married for 66 years until her death in 2019. For Dad, the ocean, and really all of nature, had both a scientific and a spiritual dimension. In 2009, Dad was honored to give the Devar Torah to the Shir Tikva congregation for Rosh Hashanah. And he quoted an anthropologist who said, "More and more, I find less and less difference between science and adoration." Dad was in complete agreement. He described how on coral reefs there are cleaning stations where the normal rules of predator-prey relationships are temporarily suspended. Huge groupers and barracudas position themselves with their heads angled upward to signal to smaller fish that they are there to be cleaned, not to hunt. And the minnows actually dart into the mouths of these larger fish to clean their teeth and eat parasites off their scales and gills, with both species benefiting. In these symbiotic relationships, Dad saw the face of God. Mary Oliver, in a poem called Sometimes, gives the following directions for living a full life. Instructions for living a life. Pay attention, be astonished, tell about it. Against that standard, Dad lived a very rich life. He spent his career as a professor of biology being astonished by nature and telling about it. Dad was the youngest of 5 children, Millicent, Dorothy, Shirley, Norman, and Sumner. He was the first in his family to go to college. He attended Hartwick College in upstate New York. After he graduated, he got his master's at UMass Amherst, where Joyce was completing her undergraduate degree. And after she graduated in 1952, they got married and moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where Dad completed his PhD at the University of Michigan. Dad joked that while he was getting his PhD, Mom got her PhD, pushing hubby through. In 1957, Dad got his first teaching job at Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin, which turned out to be his last teaching job as well. He taught at Lawrence for 38 years. His area of research, on which he published dozens of academic papers, was on the feeding strategy of copepods, which, as you know, are barely macroscopic zooplankton. So infectious was Dad's enthusiasm for ecology and marine biology that 40 of his former students went on to become biologists themselves, including the scientist who took Dad's position when he retired. Dad couldn't have been prouder. One of Dad's signature programs at Lawrence was something he called Marine Term. Students who signed up for the program were required to become certified scuba divers, and in addition to learning all about the ecology and geology of coral reefs, Dad would take the entire class to the Cayman Islands during spring break, where they would do research projects on the coral reefs that surrounded the islands. As a lawyer, I can only cringe at the liability exposure involved in taking 15 college students to a remote island with limitless supplies of cheap rum and ganja, with virtually no experience in scuba diving, and expect them to do field research in 60 feet of water. But Dad's childlike enthusiasm could quickly overcome any such practical or logistical objections. Dad's love of education continued even after his formal career as an educator had ended. After he and my mom moved to the Twin Cities, for years he was a volunteer in the cell lab at the Science Museum of Minnesota. He would lead groups of 4th graders through the process of extracting DNA from wheat germ, but he wouldn't stop there. After the kids completed the extraction, Dad would then explain how each of them had DNA in every cell in their bodies and how their DNA was unique, different from every other person on the planet. Do you know what that means? Dad would ask them. That means you're special. Only Dad could turn a lesson on DNA into a self-esteem building exercise. Not surprisingly, the Science Museum honored Dad by naming him the Outstanding Volunteer of the Year. Dad took it as his personal mission to encourage young people to go to college. Dad would accost every cashier, server, barista, busboy, and bagger who looked to be in their teens to find out what his or her plans were when they graduated from high school. And often he would invite them back to his home with their parents so he could help them choose colleges that matched their interests and strengthen their applications. And throughout it all, Dad's own passion for learning never ebbed. Although he did not receive a Jewish education as a child, he found a spiritual home here at Shir Tikva. And he and our mom took Rabbi Offner's Jewish practice and beliefs class. He was then inspired to be bar mitzvahed himself, which he accomplished here at age 72, even learning enough phonetic Hebrew to chant Torah. So I had the great blessing to see both my father and my son called to the Torah at Shir Tikva at each of their bar mitzvahs. Dad's third great passion was his family. As a boy, his father told him that his mother had died when he was a baby. Only as an adult did he learn the truth. His mother had been institutionalized in a state hospital with what we now understand to be bipolar disorder. He was actually 17 when his mother died, but he never had the chance to meet her because his father thought it would protect him to withhold the truth. Perhaps having lost the opportunity to know his own mother, he clung even more fiercely to his own family, his wife Joyce, and the three of us, Nancy, me, and Freya. We grew up in Appleton, Wisconsin, but Dad's research took us all over the country and the world. We spent a year in La Jolla, California, while Dad was doing research at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography. We spent another year in Solomon's Island, Maryland, on the Chesapeake Bay. We spent 6 months in Israel, while Dad was doing research on the coral reefs in the Red Sea, and several summers in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, on Cape Cod, and in the Boundary Waters, where Lawrence had a field station. Dad spent 2 weeks living in an underwater laboratory in 50 feet of water off the coast of Puerto Rico, making his nickname Prescient. We didn't go along on that trip, but he sent us letters with a special postmark that read, "Dispatched from the ocean floor." Dad always shared his research with us over the dinner table, and from grade school, we could easily tell a copepod from a Daphnia, and were disdainful of anyone who couldn't. I never understood why I wasn't more popular in school. He also shared with us his love of nature. On hikes, Dad would wade into streams and turn over rocks to show us the organisms living underneath. Depending on the species he found, he could tell us about the water quality of the streams. After completing his lesson, Dad always carefully returned the rock to its original position to minimize the disruption to the fauna. The whole family shared Dad's love of the ocean. All 3 of the kids became certified scuba divers. I started diving at age 16. And once we were adults, Dad hosted all the kids and grandkids on Grand Cayman Island, where we all scuba dove together. One of our favorite family activities was beachcombing, walking on the beach looking for treasure. We would never come home empty-handed. We would find shark's teeth, a perfect sand dollar, a twisty piece of driftwood, colorful sea glass, a lobster buoy, an interesting rock. In our family, treasure was very broadly defined. Dad taught us about the ecology of the intertidal zone, the barnacles, starfish, sea urchins, hermit crabs, kelp, and mussels. The tide pools were our textbooks, as Dad explained the drama of territorialism, symbiosis, and predator-prey interactions going on beneath the seemingly placid surface of the water. When I was going into 4th grade, we moved to California for Dad's sabbatical year at Scripps. Our parents bought a small tent camper, which folded down into a box that Dad towed behind the car. We spent a month traveling from Wisconsin to California, visiting as many national and state parks as we could fit in over the course of the month, and did the same on the way back. at the end of the year. It was extremely important to Dad that we make good time. So every morning, seemingly at the crack of dawn, Dad would call out, "Good morning, campers, it's time to get up." And we would struggle to get out of bed and start our day. But the highlight for me was at bedtime. We would all be snuggled into our sleeping bags in the camper, and Dad, on the spot, would make up a word game for us to play. The game was always a variant of 20 questions, but Dad always added enough new categories, dares, bluffs, challenges, wild cards, to make each night's version seem brand new. And I realize now that the point was never really about guessing the word. The real entertainment was in watching Dad make up the game on the fly as we played, ad-libbing new rules like Calvin Ball. And invariably, we would all be in hysterics long before anyone had guessed the word. Dad's commitment to his family continued after our mom was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Not only was Dad Mom's devoted caretaker for years until her death, he became active in Alzheimer's support groups, advocating for families impacted by this terrible disease, and teaching about the importance of care for the caretakers, lessons he applied to everyone except himself. There's a poem by an unknown author that Dad often shared with his students and even included it on his final exams to ease the stress of the moment. It reflects perfectly how Dad felt about the ocean, but with a little substitution also reflects what Dad meant to us. "I love you," I whispered into the ear of the ocean. "Ever since I've known you, I've loved you. I must see all your marvels, know all your beauty." And the ocean listened and snuggled still closer to me. We'll miss you, Dad.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you to Rabbi Ariel and the staff at Shir Tikva. Thank you to Mary Jo for always being there for us. She's collaborated on so many projects. We all want to be you when we grow up. Thank you to Emma and Sam, who flew across the country and will have to turn around and fly right back because they have audiences waiting to hear them play. And thank you to everyone who's joining us online. We feel your presence and we love you for it. And I just want to give a special welcome to Professor Bart DeStasio, who's here from Appleton, from Lawrence University, who's literally sits in the chair that Sumner vacated when he retired from the school. He was on that trip to the Caymans and took me diving on the wreck of the Balboa because I was too principled to wear a t-shirt of a place that I had not been to. So he took me on a dive. My father walked too fast. Everywhere he went, he felt no compunction about leaving his slower companions behind, sometimes by 50 yards. My mother was constantly calling for him to at least stay within sight. He was a go-getter, was always on a mission which may have been driven primarily by anxiety, which unfortunately we all seem to have inherited. You could expect him at your house 45 minutes before you'd invited him. It was sort of a family trait. His brother Norm might pull into your driveway at 8 a.m. for a family lunch called for 1 in the afternoon. Sub was always early for a dinner reservation, in the waiting room at a doctor's office, or early for the theater. He was definitely first in the door for anything general admission. My father, our Father, who art in heaven. Just kidding. Sub would kick a stone down the road as we walked along, and it would go straight as an arrow, bouncing along the pavement 10 yards. And then we'd keep walking, often while whistling the theme from Bridge Over the River Kwai, which we found hilarious because you can't whistle and smile at the same time, until we had caught up to the stone. And then he'd send it 20 more yards straight as an arrow down the road. He took us on what he called drives into autumn, when he'd navigate along crisp, scenic routes and we'd pick apples and buy pumpkins. He liked to hang heirloom corn on our front door. He took us to football games at the college and sometimes at Lambeau Field. He led family football games in the backyard. He called it throwing around the old pigskin. And we'd huddle up and he'd make up a play. Okay, you go right, you go left. He installed a swing set in our backyard with cement footings and a jungle gym to climb on. We had croquet and badminton and a ping pong table. When he was younger, he built cabinets and bookcases and the fluorescent light above the fish tank. He rigged up the stereo system in our house with a speaker built in each bedroom and in the wall in each bedroom. And you could use them like an intercom and even talk to the person waiting at the front door. I have no idea how he did that. His workbench was a mess of ancient tools and tiny drawers full of hardware. If something needed fixing, he'd fish around in all that stuff until he came up with something that worked, a washer or a cotter pin. He rigged up a system of pulleys and straps in the rafters of his garage to suspend a wooden Old Town canoe, which he could lower directly onto the roof of the car. He invited an exchange student to live in our home and spend a year at our high school, except she wasn't from another country, but from Chicago. He treated her like a daughter, and when she told him that what she knew of Jews was all the anti-Semitic tropes, that they were greedy misers who ran the banks and smelled of garlic or something, he replied with an equally ridiculous list of black stereotypes, and then they had a good laugh and were on the same page. The air cleared. He was well-rounded. He loved music and the arts. He used to express regret that his colleagues in humanities seemed to know so little about science. I know about Shakespeare and Bernstein. Why can't they learn about Darwin? He collected records. When I was 4 or 5, I used to request that a record be put on the player. My parents had Broadway original cast albums. He himself played the role of Nathan Detroit in their play reading group, Basement Theater. There was Dionne Warwick, Frank Sinatra, Al Hirt, George Shearing. I'm going to cry over Alan Sherman. Harry Belafonte. And he had classical records. He had Prokofiev and Beethoven. I heard about Arthur Rubinstein from him, Bruno Walter and Leonard Bernstein. When I met Karen, she said we were the only family she knew who sang along with symphonies. We were lucky growing up because our parents' friends were largely our father's faculty colleagues. And they weren't just scientists, they were everyone. The artists, economists, political science, a German professor, a physicist, musicians. And they were all there at parties and picnics and dinners at our home, exchanging ideas. There was a sculpture on the campus of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute that depicted some men and women engaged in conversation. He talked about that sculpture often. He thought that dialogue among equals was the heart and soul of academia. He was a champion of scientific inquiry and the liberal arts model of education. He told me repeatedly, you don't go to school to get a job, you go to school to get an education. My career certainly proved that theory. His being part of that small university ensured we heard the orchestra play and the jazz band and brilliant world-touring classical performers, and it for sure set us on a path toward a love of learning and of community involvement. He was an odd mix of indulgence and frugality. We always had the things we needed and most of the things we wanted, especially me, since I always had my eye on an expensive road bike or a high-end turntable. He was never too far behind on technological advances. We had all the various Apple computers. He liked a new car. But he favored Toyota mostly, not BMW. He didn't see the point of having more than 4 cylinders, and he never had leather seats. That seemed like a matter of principle for him. It drove me crazy. He brought us to every national park from Acadia to Big Sur. I spent most of my childhood in the way back of a station wagon with a dog and a Coleman cooler. He could back a tent trailer into a campsite between 2 trees with 4 inches clearance. He could do the same with a 17-foot sailboat down a ramp. He loved sailing, small boats, day sailors, he called them. Our best boat was a Thistle. That boat was wood, too. He took great care painting the hull, including one neat white stripe just above the waterline. We never actually raced it, but we pretended to all the time, making fast maneuvers around random markers, calling out heartily as we changed the sails. He taught first us, and later his grandchildren, the genus and species of all kinds of things. Agaricea agaricides, Parides parides, Fungia fungites, Phragmites, Potamogeton, and of course, Copepida cyclopada, and last but certainly not least, Daphnia pulex. He gave us crustacean anatomy lessons of clams and lobster, especially at newspaper-covered tables over broth and drawn butter. He did not keep kosher. No matter where he lived, Appleton or Roseville or London, he had a favorite Chinese restaurant. He and Joyce would go practically every week, and he learned the names of all the staff and their children. They'd call him Grandpa. One time, he had returned for a second stint teaching at the Lawrence University London program after having been away I don't know how long. He went straight to his favorite Chinese restaurant in Soho. The proprietor looked at him and said, "Where have you been?" He loved black licorice and pistachios. He was left-handed. His handwriting and his signature were totally unique. He preferred scotch and water, no ice. He used to say things like gadzooks, which he sometimes shortened to just Gad. His childhood memories were like folklore. We'd all heard these tales so many times. After a while, I could tell them better than he could. I'd admonish him, that's not how it goes. About his boats, Joyce 1 and Joyce 2, about his clam digging days. Almost all his stories involved one Bobby Frazier, with whom I recently corresponded. He recalled to me how much he learned about navigating life from Sub and about how they decided that the worst thing you could be was ignorant, and that's why they both worked so hard to make something of themselves. Some of the stories we all knew included how the two of them managed to set a neighbor lady's bushes on fire, possibly while conducting experiments to see whether or not bushes were in fact flammable. And then when they had extinguished the flames with her garden hose, she gave them a hero's welcome. Or how he joined a Catholic drum and bugle corps because he wanted to play the drum, and they had given him an instrument and a cool uniform, including a cape with crosses on the back. Grandpa Abraham nearly plotzed. There was a time that Sub had gotten brand new hip boots for wading and digging clams, and he had gotten himself stuck in the mud while the tide was coming in. The Coast Guard had to come to his rescue. I can just hear how he told it. He had the Coast Guard man calling to him, "Give me your hand, kid." But that lifeguard was pulling him right out of his boots. That was a deal breaker for Sub. He let go his hand. He'd risk drowning, but he was not leaving without those boots. And the Coast Guard man was not too happy about having to dig those boots free with the tide rising faster and faster. But the best one was how he and Bobby were out in a small boat when their outboard motor failed. They agreed they'd each row 100 strokes, then trade places. And things went well for a while until there was a dispute over how many pulls Bobby had taken. There, he said, 100. That wasn't 100, Sub protested. You're at 99. It was 100. Either take over or get out. This is my boat. Never mind that they were 2 miles offshore, Sub got out and swam in, drifting several miles down the coast as he swam. How he managed to hitchhike home in soaking wet clothing is a mystery. The greater mystery is how they survived their adolescence. But the most famous story of all is how he wooed my mother from a kayak floating outside the porch of her house, singing to her, Amapola, my pretty little poppy. What girl in 1946 could resist something that romantic? Sumner documented our family life and travels on slides with his fancy camera. He'd gather us around the silver screen for cozy shows. I loved those nights. In the darkened living room, everyone in their designated spots, with the soothing drone of the projector fan and that certain sound it made moving the slides in and out. He explained many things to us since he was a scientist who knew about the natural order of things. Still, unless you were asking specifically about plankton, there was a pretty good chance he was going to make up his answer. You'd say something like, Dad, why does the road look like it has water on it when it's clearly not raining and we're driving in the desert and it disappears when we get closer? He'd say, well, you see. He'd get this gleam in his eye and a look on his face, sort of sheepish, sort of laughing at himself. The water molecules in the air. Okay, you have no idea, do you? No. The water molecules in the air. Okay, never mind. I've calculated conservatively that he played 91,120 games of gin rummy in his life. And that number is probably low. He taught us all how to play, and he was hard to beat. He was difficult to beat at a lot of games because he was very competitive. He was not interested in letting you win because you were 10 years old. He was not above gloating, I win, he'd remind you. We all have our inner child, and I think his was still seeking the affirmation and attention he missed growing up with no mother and a cranky and distracted father. He and Joyce could have starred in a play called The Gin Game, all of their own making. He'd pick up his winning card and declare, now that's a smart card. And that's how you knew you just lost. Or he'd ask you triumphantly, what's the name of this game? Before laying his cards on the table. Gin. Sub was the youngest of 5. Being the youngest is not easy. Your siblings leave you out of the planning because they think you're 5 years old. They order you around like they're your parents. They act like they're the boss of him. They tell you ask too many questions and they have absolutely no interest in your life or your feelings. They think your memories are incorrect, that you couldn't possibly be in possession of any useful knowledge. Now, I'm sure Sub's father and his family were proud of him, but I don't know if he heard about it much. And then, when he finally found out he had been lied to, that his mother hadn't died in childbirth, which you can only imagine what that alone had done to his psyche, but that she had actually been alive in a mental hospital until he was 17 years old, a fact of which he did not become aware until he was 75 years old, that he might have visited his mother and tried to know her and understand what she was going through even a little. He was understandably crushed. He had discovered the actual date of her death when he located her gravesite, and he was able to secure copies of her medical records, a file 3 inches thick I only just found out he was in possession of and read myself 4 days ago. Sub couldn't have been more proud of his children and his grandchildren, all with their high-level pursuits. Noah's scholarship, Emma's violin, Sam's art and design and music. He was only too happy to drive his grandchildren anywhere they needed to go, collaborating with us parents when we needed to be somewhere else. Every Wednesday, we'd go to his house. I'd take Emma to her lesson not far away, and then an hour later, he'd take Sam for his lesson and bring Emma back. And then we'd eat barbecue chicken and spaghetti he'd make exactly the same way every single week. And we did that for years. He bought the violins and a custom-made bow. He paid for the lessons and the camps and the institute, supported all the grandchildren's educations, never missed a performance. And before them, he did that for us. He told us we'd have to stand on our own 2 feet, but when the chips were down, he was always there with some sort of bailout. I've always been proud of the fact that, at least among limnologists, he was a big deal. He discovered that plankton were selective feeders and not filter feeders and a few other things, and he has literally hundreds of research papers in all kinds of journals. I was fascinated by his stories of bomb calorimeters and how one time they actually managed to attach a dog hair to the head of a copepod with some sort of underwater superglue so they could keep track of one individual for a short period of time. I still don't entirely believe it. His work took him all over the world, including a semi-dangerous 2-week project living in an underwater habitat to study the effects of silt on the coral reefs near Puerto Rico. And he literally called us from the ocean floor. For years, he brought a slideshow about the experience to schools, along with all manner of scientific show and tell. Even in his assisted living facility, he gave regular lectures on species diversity, adaptability, and evolution. When we were young, he'd get invited on radio talk shows to debate crazy creationists. He'd point out how incredibly inspiring and spiritually fulfilling was the process of natural selection. It was, in fact, proof positive of a higher order, not the other way. He advised and inspired countless students over his 38-year teaching career, and in fact never stopped. In some ways, he was more attentive to his advisees than to his own children. He could be distracted. He sometimes wasn't a very good listener. We often caught him waiting his turn to tell you his latest achievement, because in many ways he was a big child. But of all the places he had worked and done research and spent time, Cape Cod was his favorite. After he retired, he still found ways to live there in West Falmouth for extended stays, and he made sure we had the means to deliver his grandchildren to him. Growing up, Emma and Sam got to spend almost every summer walking on the beach, collecting hermit crabs in buckets, touring science museums and aquariums, and visiting labs and offices still inhabited by colleagues or former students. We made the beach lunches every day and the happy hour every evening. We walked on boards through the salt marsh, peering in tide pools. We played candle pin bowling and ate ice cream and saltwater taffy. He wanted to make sure his grandchildren were connected to the ocean and its wonders. The night he passed away, we were with him. He left an hour after we did. On our way out, one of his caregivers was there, and she delivered an impromptu eulogy of her own. She's worked at Waverly Gardens 17 years. She said she knew my parents from the time they first moved in. She recalled what a fierce advocate he was for our mother. He was totally devoted to her. The reason he moved to Waverly Gardens in the first place was precisely because it was the only place he could find where one person could receive memory care and still live with their independent spouse. She recalled how he insisted on staying by her side even when she had to move to another area entirely. He was the only independent person in the memory care unit. He fed her and administered her medications. He kissed her and told her he loved her every single night. After she was gone, he kissed her picture. He moved out of that memory care to a different part of Waverly Gardens when Joyce passed, and then only 2.5 years later, we had to move him back. Pandemic isolation was not what anyone needed, but it was hardest on the elderly. Now, I realize I'm going on too long, and that probably the reason Jews have funerals so quickly after someone passes away is to prevent family members from having quite so long to write their eulogies. But I just think it would be remiss to close here without a short discussion of the evolution of the moth population of London during the Industrial Revolution. I'm not kidding. You see, the buildings in London are primarily sandstone. They're light-colored sandstone. Light-colored moths are camouflaged on the surface of the buildings. Any moth unlucky enough to be born a darker color was more likely to be picked off by hungry birds. Therefore, the light-colored moths survived more often to pass on their traits to the next generation. But later, during the Industrial Revolution, London became dirtier and the buildings took on a darker cast. Gradually, it became more advantageous to be a darker moth. Light-colored moths became dinner much more often, and within several generations, and with continued pollution, the moth population of London shifted almost entirely dark. Later, when Londoners had had enough, the buildings were power washed, new environmental standards went into effect, and guess what? The population shifted back. When someone asked my father, how come we don't see evolution happening today? He'd tell this story. Sumner Richman was a complicated man. He overcame a lot of troubles, but also never overcame them. I'm not at all certain any of us actually overcomes the ways we've been messed up by our family. If we're lucky, we learn to cope. But it certainly is a lot easier to understand and empathize and forgive your parents when you know something about what they went through in their own lives. Sub's bravado masked a lot of personal self-doubt, but he always forged ahead. We all had to run just to keep up with him. He was playful and loving, and in the end, that's what it really came down to. Love. I'd walk into his apartment, and he'd be there with his arms outstretched, proclaiming, "Oh, I love you." Those were some of the last full sentences he could even say. I love you. I love you.
I'm not sure what one can say to follow that. So briefly, Robert and Freya spoke beautifully about Dad's love for the ocean and how the family shared that love with him. In fact, when I retired in March of 2022, I moved from Indiana to southern Rhode Island to live near the ocean. I'd simply like to share with you my favorite ocean poem, one that Dad also loved, written 25 years ago by his sister, Shirley Gash. Moving from horizon to the shore, swells curve high, crest, and break in foamy swirls. Green with white foam marbling the sea, streaking to a ruffled edge, eddies back to join, regroup, as it were. Inexorable movement, ebb and flow, the oceans show. At times the crest is torn and spindrift, tossed in fan-like foam. The droplets spray into the sky. Another element, the wind, as though it seeks to be included in the frolic, speaks. Surge, surge, white swirls on green, swells curve to break and crash in foam. In all the primal force, between land and sea, I find myself, the sea is me. Thank you all for being with us today. It means a lot to us.
Thank you so much, you lyrical bunch. It's incredible. It's incredible to hear the talent of storytelling refracted and the love of words and language to connect us. Thank you so much for bringing your father into this space and for lifting his multiplicity, his fullness up for us. So when describing Sumner's growing up, Freya told me, she recounted what she called Sumner's little rascal's childhood. And it's not hard to imagine intrepid Sub sailing off into the ocean that was his backyard, aiming his attention to the sea. And believe it or not, the Talmud is full of little rascals stories that don't sound that different from the stories of Sub's adventures on the coast of Nantasket. Rabbis sailing off into the sea, facing danger and intrigue, and returning with Torah, with important lessons that they only could have learned by sailing out into open water. And through these stories, I think we can access some of the power of Sumner's life, moving through. So in one story, Rabbi Akiva was sailing, and his ship sank, and he narrowly managed to make it to shore. And when he was asked what saved him, he said, "A daf of the boat appeared for me, and to every wave that came my way, I bowed my head." And Talmud offers us a pun. A daf is a plank. It's a piece of shipwreck floating in the waters, but daf is also a word for the page of a Talmud. So in this understanding, it's learning that saves the sage's life, that helps him find his way back to shore. And I would say that Sumner held on to the daf throughout his life, focusing on study and helping others find their way to learning. He was, as we have all said, he was a committed mentor and teacher of his students at Lawrence University, of his children and his grandchildren, of the members of his community. He was a passionate proponent of liberal arts learning and the power of critical thinking and thoughtful engagement. He believed that discussion and debate and research were keys to helping people improve. It didn't matter what people studied, but that we learned. And there's a second story about a sage who capsizes in the ocean. This time it concerns a certain righteous man who would regularly give charity. And once he went out on a boat, the common theme throughout these eulogies, and a wind came along, and his boat sank into the sea. And he managed to make it back to shore. And he was asked, "What brought you out of the sea?" And he replied, "The tzedakah, the charity that I gave, the justice that I sought, is what brought me out of the sea." And he continued, "When I was sinking down into the depths of the sea, I heard a voice coming from the roar of the waves. And each of the waves said to the other, 'Come, let us crash together and raise this man out of the sea. For he gave charity, he sought justice all of his life.'" So Sumner was a beloved past president of Shir Tikva who presided over, as Freya called it, an era of love. Sumner cared that people connected with one another, that our community was strong and connected. And as Shir Tikva's Rabbi Emerita, Rabbi Stacy Offner, shared, Sumner was a teacher of how to care for people, with all of your heart, soul, and might. Sub contributed to the world around him through his intellect and expansive heart, and he lifted others up through his service and his care. Sumner, who cared about active and critical engagement and learning, was a lifelong learner, a courageous explorer of the world and his own spirituality and capacity. May Sumner's memory be a blessing and an inspiration. May those who knew and loved him honor his legacy by digging into our own passions, by teaching and mentoring, and by giving back to community and protecting the ocean. May we merit to be as active of heart and mind, even a little piece as active of heart and mind as Dr. Sumner Richman. May his spirit be raised up as though by the crashing waves, for he gave charity and made the world a more wonderful place all of his life. We'll offer words of Psalm 23, which are words of comfort and of grounding. And then it will be time to say El Malei Rachamim, which are traditional words that are meant to uplift the soul of those who have recently died. Mizmor leDavid, Adonai roi lo echsar, binot Esher על מי מנוחות ינהלני. נפשי אשובב, נפשי אשובב, ינחני במעגלי צדק למען שמו. גם כי אלך בקיצה למוות, לא אירא רע, כי אתה עמדי. שבטך ומשענתך, שבטך ומשענתך, המה ינחמוני. תערוך לפני שולחן, תערוך לפני שולחן, תערוך לפני שולחן, נגד צורריי. תשענת ושמן ראשי, תשענת ושמן ראשי, תשענת ושמן ראשי, כוסי רוויה. אך טוב החסד ירדפוני כל ימי חיי, ושבתי בבית אדוני, ושבתי בבית אדוני לאורך ימים. You are my shepherd, I am content. You lead me to rest in the sweet grasses, to lie down by the quiet waters, and I am refreshed. You lead me down the right path, the path that unwinds in the pattern of your name. And even if I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will not fear, for you are with me, comforting me with your rod and your staff, showing me each step. You prepare a table for me in the midst of my adversity and moisten my head with oil. Surely my cup is overflowing, and goodness and kindness will follow me all the days of my life, and in the long days beyond, I will always live within your house. I'll invite our community to rise in body and spirit as we recite El Malei Rachamim. El Malei Rachamim, shochen bar meromim, המצא מנוחה נכונה על כנפי השכינה, במעלות קדושים וטהורים כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים, את נשמת שמואל בן אברהם בית-אל שהלך לעולמו, בגן עדן תהא מנוחתו. לכן בעל הרחמים יסתירהו בסתר כנפיו לעולמים, ויצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתו. אדוני הוא נחלתו, וינוח בשלום על משכבו. v'nomar Amen. God, full of mercy, dwelling in the heavens' heights, bring proper rest on the wings of your Shekhinah, your divine presence, to the soul of Shmuel ben Avraham ve'Ethel, Sumner Richman, for whom prayer is offered in the memory of his soul. May the merciful one protect his soul forever and bind his soul with eternal life. The everlasting is his heritage, and he shall rest peacefully at his lying place. And let us say, Amen. So we're going to recite now Kadisha Tom. I'm going to invite us just to take a moment together, to take a breath, recognizing that the work of mourning, the work of remembering, is not a one-time work, and that the process and the practice of reciting Kadisha Tom, of reciting Mourner's Kaddish, isn't the chance to return again and again, to check in with our own hearts, to check in with the hearts of those who are mourning, to say, how are you today? What story is coming to mind today? And to, with the words of Kadisha Tom, lift those stories, and with that, lift the memory of Sumner. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, ve'alma divrach yirutei ve'amlich malchutei, ve'chayechon uvyomechon uvchaye dechol beit Yisrael, ba'agala uvizman kariv v'imru amen. Yehi shmei Rabbah mevorach leolam ulamei amaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh. V'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shmei d'kudsha brichu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata. Tush bechata v'nechemata. Damiran ve'alma v'imru amen. Yehi shlam arava min shemaya. V'chaim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom. Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'al kol yoshvei tevel v'imru amen. You may be seated. So as we come to the end of this memorial service, in a moment you'll be invited to recess out into the social hall, where you're invited to greet the mourners and to offer your condolences and to share stories. Please follow the mourners' leads, and if just a brief greeting is what is wanted, please follow their leads, and if it's time to share stories, please do so. In honor of Sumner, may there be many, many stories told in these next days. So there's a Shiva tonight at 7 p.m. at Robert's house. You're invited to look online to find the address, and you'll be able to continue to offer your condolences and share stories there. And I just want to offer to all those who are mourning, to all those who are remembering Sumner, Hamakom yinachem etchem b'toch avlei Tzion v'Yerushalayim. May you know comfort, may you be surrounded by love, and may the stories that you hear in this time fill you up. And so I'm going to invite Emma at this time to come back up, accompanied by Mary Jo Othman. Thank you so much for weaving this service through with so much beautiful music. So we'll close listening to this beautiful music, and then mourners will recess out into the social hall, followed by the rest of the community. Good morning, everyone.